Britain has a reputation for order, independent courts, the rule of law, one of the world's most stable economies. Most people believe organized crime on this scale happens somewhere else. Investigators who spent decades inside these cases say that was always the wrong assumption. These are Britain's most brutal gangs, and the drug lords who built them. Section 1. Curtis Warren. Curtis Warren received his first criminal conviction at the age of 12. The offense was car theft. By 15, he had added burglary and a period of youth detention. These early convictions were not remarkable in themselves. Toxteth in the 1970s was one of the most economically stripped areas in England, and the pipeline from those streets to those courts was well worn by the time Warren entered it. What distinguished him from almost everyone else who came through the same pipeline was what he built afterward. Not a life of petty recycling through short sentences and street-level dealing, but an international trafficking operation so large that two countries spent the better part of 2 decades trying to dismantle it, and that still carries his name in the intelligence files of every serious organized crime agency in Europe. By the early 1980s, Warren was working as a nightclub bouncer in Liverpool. The doorwork gave him access to venues, to cash, to a social circle that extended across the city in useful directions. He used it the way many men in that position used it, as a base for running cannabis. The shift from cannabis to harder drugs followed a logic that is consistent across almost every serious trafficking operation that began in that era. Cannabis is bulky. The profit per kilogram is modest when set against what cocaine or heroin returns at similar volumes. A criminal with enough capital and enough ambition will run the same calculation every time. Warren ran it. He moved into cocaine and began building relationships with suppliers on the European continent, initially operating the way British traffickers typically operated at that time, buying from Dutch or Spanish intermediaries who sourced from South America. That was the standard model. It was profitable, but it left multiple layers of margin on the table. The decision that changed Warren's entire trajectory was his move to trade directly with the Cali cartel in Colombia. This had not been done by a British criminal before. The Cali cartel controlled an estimated 80% of the world's cocaine supply at its peak in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It was an organization of enormous sophistication, experienced in managing international logistics, in insulating its principals from exposure, in maintaining the kind of operational discipline that had kept its leaders functioning through years of law enforcement pressure. Getting access to those principles required more than money. It required trust, which in that world is built slowly through intermediaries and proven through successful transactions over time. Warren built it. The courts have never fully established the precise sequence of introductions that gave him access to the cartel, but the outcome is a matter of legal record. He was buying cocaine at the production end of the supply chain, not at the distribution end. The difference between those two prices, at the volumes Warren was moving, produced a fortune that courts would later estimate at up to £300 million. That figure placed him, at his peak, on the Sunday Times rich list. He was the first convicted criminal to appear on that list. He was listed as a property developer. It is worth holding that detail against the rest of his case. The list is compiled from declared assets, visible income, and known business interests. Warren was on it not because his drug wealth was visible, but because some portion of it had been routed through property and businesses in a way that produced a surface income consistent with legitimate wealth. The scale of the laundering required to move a £300 million fortune through legitimate channels is itself a significant criminal enterprise, and it operated successfully for years. By 1996, Warren had relocated to the Netherlands. He settled in the town of Sassenheim, near Leiden, positioning himself at the center of European drug distribution. The Dutch geography was useful. Amsterdam had long functioned as one of the primary transit hubs for cocaine entering Europe from South America. Being based there reduced logistics. It also placed Warren in a different jurisdiction from Merseyside police, who had been watching him for years and had not managed to build a prosecutable case. He had a talent for operating at distance from the physical product, which is the central protection any principal in a trafficking network uses. The people who handled the drugs were not Warren. The people who transported the money were not Warren. The messages that gave instructions used coded language and intermediary communication. Merseyside police knew what he was doing. They could not prove it in a court to the standard required. When Warren moved to the Netherlands, British officers did something unusual. They went to the Dutch police and briefed them. They shared intelligence, operational histories, the names of associates, the methods Warren had used to evade detection in Liverpool. It was an early example of the kind of cross-border law enforcement cooperation that would later become standard practice against serious organized crime groups. The Dutch ran their own surveillance operation and accumulated the evidence that British police had spent years failing to gather. In 1997, they moved. What police found across the properties linked to Warren's Dutch operation was set out in court: 400 kilograms of cocaine, 100 kilograms of heroin, more than 1,000 kilograms of cannabis, 50 kilograms of ecstasy. The total value of the operation had been estimated at around £125 million. Warren was convicted in a Dutch court and sentenced to 12 years. He was transferred through Belgian custody during part of the sentence. While in prison, he killed a fellow inmate during a confrontation, adding further time to the period he would spend inside. He completed most of the sentence and was released in 2007. He was in his mid-40s when he came out. The fortune was largely inaccessible, having been either confiscated, hidden, or consumed by the operational costs of running a network of that size across multiple jurisdictions over many years. The rumours that circulated after his release described buried cash around Liverpool, money put in place before his arrest, and left untouched during the decade he was away. Sources have suggested he had spoken, before his arrest, of an ability to spend around £50,000 per day without depleting his resources. Whether the buried caches were ever recovered is not something any court proceeding has established. It is not the kind of detail Warren has ever chosen to address in public. Within a year or two of his release, he was organising again. The operation he put together next was centred on Jersey. The Channel Island sits outside the standard British customs perimeter in certain respects, and had, by the late 2000s, developed a reputation among drug traffickers as a viable import point. Warren planned to bring in cannabis with a street value of around £1 million as a first shipment. The prosecution at his subsequent trial described that figure as a starting amount, and recorded phone conversations showed Warren referring to it in exactly those terms, describing the £1 million load as a little starter. It was the kind of remark that prosecutors read to juries with care and that tends to stay with them into deliberations. Jersey police had placed listening devices in the vehicles Warren was using. His phone lines were tapped. Officers photographed him at meetings in parks and on beaches on the island, meeting associates to plan the logistics of the operation. He was arrested in Jersey. The jury at the Royal Court in St Helier deliberated for around 9 hours and returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Warren showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. He was sentenced in 2009 to 13 years. The financial proceedings that ran alongside the criminal case were significant. MRC, and later the courts, had been tracking Warren's finances for years, and the accumulated picture produced a confiscation demand that at one stage reached £198 million in terms of recoverable benefit from crime. Warren contested portions of those proceedings but eventually agreed to terms with Haymark that resulted in a serious crime prevention order. The order placed conditions on his life after release. Scotland was a prohibited area, WhatsApp was barred, cryptocurrency trading was barred, contact with named individuals was restricted. These are not conditions placed on ordinary offenders. They are conditions designed specifically for someone whose capacity to reconstitute a criminal network was taken seriously enough to warrant structural legal barriers rather than simply a warning. He was released from the Jersey sentence in the early 2020s after serving approximately 13 years. He was by then approaching 60. Merseyside police, in the period before his release, expressed concern publicly about what his return to the streets might mean for the current distribution of territory in Liverpool. The city's drug economy had reorganized considerably during the 2 decades Warren had been inside across his 2 major sentences, and the prospect of his return injecting instability into an already volatile environment was a concern that officers stated directly. The last thing anyone in law enforcement wanted, sources indicated, was Warren coming back and destabilizing what was already a dangerous situation. The question Warren raises goes beyond the facts of his particular case. He had, by the time of his first Dutch conviction, enough money to live comfortably for several lifetimes. He had served a 12-year sentence in foreign custody. He had killed a man in prison. He knew the British, Dutch, and Irish law enforcement agencies had him as a priority target. And yet, within a year or 2 of release, he was in Jersey planning the next operation. The standard explanation is greed, and greed is part of it. But greed alone does not quite account for a man who already has access to hundreds of millions of pounds. What makes more sense when examined is the structural reality of operating at that level. A legitimate business owner who retires can sell what he has built. Warren could not sell the Cali cartel relationship. He could not transfer the trust that European drug wholesalers had placed in him personally over 30 years. He could not advertise his distribution network for buyers. All of it was tied to his name, his reputation, his physical presence in the operation. The moment he stepped away, those assets began to decay. The network he had built was worth something only as long as he was running it. The economics of that situation do not point toward retirement. They point toward continuation. He was also, by that point, the most famous drug trafficker Britain had ever produced. That reputation carried its own logic. It created expectations among the people around him. It created obligations that could not simply be set aside. Walking away from it completely would have required going somewhere else entirely, disappearing in a way that the Serious Crime Prevention Order made structurally difficult. He could not leave England freely. He could not use encrypted communications. He was, in a real sense, a man whose assets were inaccessible and whose movements were monitored, living in the city where his name meant something specific, surrounded by a world where that specific meaning had only one application. Warren remains the template against which British drug trafficking at the top level is measured. The direct relationship with South American supply, the physical separation from the product, the distance maintained between the principal and the hands-on criminal activity, the use of legitimate business fronts to absorb and explain cash, the European transit infrastructure. All of these were established operating principles in his network before they became standard practice across British organised crime. The men who came after him used the same architecture. They changed the communications technology and the geographic footprint. The logic was Warren's, and it came from Toxteth, through Amsterdam, through a Belgian prison cell, through a courtroom in Jersey, and eventually back to Liverpool. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next, a gang that took that architecture and embedded it into the streets of one English city so deeply that removing them required 8 years, 80,000 phone records, and 6 protected witnesses. Section 2. The Gooch Close Gang. The Gooch Close Gang emerged in the early 1980s. Its membership was drawn primarily from young men of Afro-Caribbean heritage, many of them from families who had come to England as part of the Windrush generation and settled in the South Manchester communities of Moss Side and Hume. The economic circumstances these families found in South Manchester by the time their children were teenagers were difficult in the specific way that produced gang formation. Unemployment among black and ethnic minority residents in Moss Side was widely reported at around 40% through the 1990s. The precinct in the centre of Moss Side, where cannabis and later heroin had been sold openly, had been subject to police pressure that pushed dealing back to the residential streets of the estate. The drug economy was the one that was operating. It was the one that produced income, reputation, and a structured role for young men who had nothing else on offer from the city around them. The Gooch controlled the west side of the Alexandra Park estate. The Doddington controlled the east side. The line between them was not drawn once and held. It was contested constantly, violently, in a cycle of retaliation that followed its own compounding logic. The Doddington gang had roots in the Pepper Hill Mob, an earlier group that took its name from a pub on the east side of the estate. When the pub closed and police pressure on that original formation increased, the group reconstituted around Doddington Close and developed its own identity and structure. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, both the Gooch and the Doddington were running drug distribution operations across South Manchester, while engaging in increasingly armed confrontations with each other and with other Manchester gangs, including the Cheetham Hill gang from the north of the city. The violence was not incidental to the drug operation. It was the enforcement mechanism. Territory that was held under threat of violence was territory from which drugs could be sold without competition. Losing territory to a rival meant losing income. The gun was the instrument by which territorial claims were asserted and defended. Between January 1997 and November 2000, there were 270 recorded shootings in South Manchester. Of those for which the relevant data existed, 16% were fatal. Someone was convicted in connection with only 8% of shootings during the same period. The conviction rate is the most important number in that sequence. It reflects a community in which witnesses did not come forward, in which fear was an effective instrument of silence, and in which the police were operating in an environment designed to prevent them from building prosecutable cases. By 1999, the Gooch alone accounted for 68% of Greater Manchester's recorded gun crimes. The gang had an estimated membership of over 250 at its peak, with territory extending from Moss Side into Whalley Range, Fallowfield, Old Trafford, and Hume. It was not a street corner operation. It was a territorial structure that controlled drug distribution across a substantial portion of South Manchester and used violence systematically to maintain that control. The youngest casualty of the drug war between these gangs was 14 years old. On a January evening in 1993, Benji Stanley was queuing at Alvino's Takeaway on Princess Road in Moss Side when he was shot dead. He had no gang affiliation. He was in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong city, during the wrong era, and he was killed for it, and nobody has ever been convicted for his murder. That case remains open. It exists in the record as a marker of the cost of that period, and as a measure of how difficult it was, through the 1990s, to bring any of the violence on those streets to a legal conclusion. The gangs understood the environment they operated in. They understood that witnesses could be silenced, that communities could be intimidated into non-cooperation, that the conviction rate of 8% was not an accident, but a structural feature of the world they had built. Colin Joyce was the man who ran the Gooch during the period it was at its most dangerous. He styled himself internally as the General, and the title was not affectation. He was not a figurehead. He organized, directed, and participated in violence. And the physical evidence that investigators would eventually find attached to him reflected a man who had structured his daily life around the practical requirements of armed gang leadership. His trouser pockets had been modified into holsters for easy access to firearms. That detail was presented in court, and it is one of those small physical specifics that does more to establish a picture of how someone actually lives than any amount of general description. Joyce was not carrying a weapon occasionally, for protection in moments of particular risk. He had altered his clothing to keep one permanently accessible. This was routine. Lee Amos was his central associate. The two had been operating together since the early years of the gang's most active period, and their relationship was close enough that when investigators eventually moved against the Gooch's leadership, they treated Joyce and Amos as a joint command structure. What the 2001 arrest established about how that command structure was sustained was significant. Officers had tracked the two men to a house in Moss Side they were using as a nerve center and found what was described in court as an extraordinary array of firearms. The specific contents of that find were not catalogued in public detail, but the language the prosecution used was not theatrical. There were multiple weapons, there was ammunition, there was infrastructure. The case resulted in 9-year sentences for both men in 2001. Joyce was released on license in March 2007. Amos was released in 2006. The street-level dealing, the territorial enforcement, and the accumulated grievances of the feud had not stopped while they were inside. The moment they were back on the streets, the violence resumed. Yukal Chin was killed in June 2007. The circumstances of his death reflected the way retaliatory violence escalates in gang conflicts. A grievance generates a response, the response generates a counter-response, and the logic that governs each stage is the logic of not backing down in an environment where backing down is understood to invite further attacks. Chin was a young man with connections to the gang's territory, and his killing was an execution. It was targeted and deliberate. The killing of Yukal Chin did not end the sequence, it extended it. On 27 July 2007, a wake was held for Yukal Chin on Frobisher Close in Longsight. Dozens of friends and associates had gathered through the evening, the kind of gathering that in ordinary circumstances provides comfort, that allows people who shared a relationship with the person who died to mark that loss collectively. Just after midnight, a car full of masked gunmen drove down the street and opened fire into the crowd. Tyrone Gilbert, 23 years old, was struck multiple times. He collapsed on the street as others dove for cover. He was pronounced dead on the way to hospital. Another man was injured. Joyce and Amos were among those who orchestrated the drive-by. The shooting of Tyrone Gilbert at the wake of a man who had himself just been killed was the act that finally gave Greater Manchester Police what they needed to build a case capable of ending the leadership of the Gooch Close gang. Operation Viola was what followed. It was described at the time as Greater Manchester Police's biggest ever organised crime investigation. The scale of what investigators assembled over the course of that inquiry established a factual picture of the gang that no previous prosecution had managed to produce. 80,000 mobile phone calls and text messages were analyzed. Wiretaps captured conversations that placed Joyce and Amos at the center of the decisions that had resulted in the murders. 6 former gang associates agreed to testify for the prosecution, which, in the context of the Moss Side gang environment, was a development of significant consequence. These were not peripheral witnesses. They were people who had been inside the organization, who knew how it operated, who could speak to specific events from direct knowledge. The fear of reprisal that had kept the conviction rate at 8% for 2 decades had not disappeared. The decision each of those 6 individuals made to testify carried real personal risk, and they knew it. The decision to hold the trial at Liverpool Crown Court, 35 miles from Manchester, was made specifically to reduce the risk of witness intimidation. The court and prosecution understood that the infrastructure of fear the Gooch had built in South Manchester was not dismantled simply because its leaders were on remand. Moving the trial to a jurisdiction outside the gang's physical reach was a practical acknowledgement of that fact. The trial began in October 2008. It ran for 6 months. On 6 April 2009, 11 members of the Gooch Close gang were convicted on 26 of 27 charges. The charges ranged across murder, attempted murder, firearms possession with intent to endanger life, and conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. The breadth of the conviction and its near-total success rate across 27 separate charges reflected the depth and quality of the evidence Operation Viola had assembled. Joyce was convicted of the murders of Ukal Chin and Tyrone Gilbert, and of the attempted murder of Michael Gordon. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 39 years. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until he has served that minimum. Amos was convicted of the murder of Tyrone Gilbert and of attempted murder and sentenced to a minimum of 35 years, later reduced to 32 on appeal. Manchester's chief prosecutor John Holt described the convictions as having enormous significance for public safety in the city. The significance was not merely symbolic. What happened to gun crime in South Manchester after the convictions is documented. The arrest and sentencing of Joyce and Amos, alongside 9 other senior members, created a leadership vacuum that the gang's remaining structure could not fill in any organized way. The hierarchical command that had directed violence, managed territory, and coordinated drug distribution for 20 years was gone. What remained fragmented into smaller, less coherent crews, without the capacity or the authority to enforce discipline across the territory the Gooch had once controlled. Gun crime in Moss Side and Longsight dropped precipitously. By 2012 and 2013, there were no recorded fatalities in those areas from gang-related shootings. The ITV documentary made about the investigation credited the convictions with producing a 90% reduction in gun crime in the city. The number needs to be held in context because gun crime had not been eliminated, and South Manchester continued to see violence linked to drugs and territory in the years that followed. But the scale of the reduction was genuine, and it was directly tied to the removal of the leadership structure that had made sustained armed conflict possible. The Gooch Close gang case demonstrates something about how gang violence at the top level actually functions that is worth understanding. The shooting on Frobisher Close at Ukal Chin's wake was not a spontaneous act. It was organized. It required a vehicle, masked operatives, coordination, and the kind of decision-making authority that only Joyce and Amos possessed within the gang structure. The evidence established this through phone records and witness testimony rather than through assumption. The logical implication of that evidence is that removing the people at the top of a command structure removes the capacity to make those kinds of organized decisions. Street-level conflict continued in South Manchester after 2009, as it continues everywhere. But the specific capacity of the Gooch to conduct a coordinated armed campaign across South Manchester, which had made it the dominant contributor to Greater Manchester's gun crime statistics for more than a decade, depended on leadership, and that leadership had been sentenced to a combined minimum of 71 years behind bars. The Young Gooch, an offshoot that had emerged in 1996 and developed its own reputation for firearms use, was itself later dismantled in a separate operation. 5 of its members were arrested following an investigation codenamed Operation Eagle and sentenced to a combined total of more than 43 years in prison. The pattern was the same, an organized structure sustained through violence and geographic control, capable of suppressing opposition until law enforcement accumulated enough evidence to dismantle the leadership layer. Removing that layer did not remove the underlying conditions that had produced the gang in the first place. Alexandra Park remained a deprived area. Unemployment remained high relative to the Manchester average. The legitimate economy still offered less than it should have to the young men growing up in its streets. The Gooch existed as a response to those conditions, as much as it existed as a choice. Understanding that does not change what Joyce and Amos did. It simply explains the ground from which they grew. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case built its empire differently, not through territory, but through a fortified mansion, a set of tarmac removal machines, and a cartel connection that reached from the Midlands all the way to the streets of Dublin. Section 3. The Kinahan Cartel's British Operation. The Kinahan Organised Crime Group is an Irish criminal organisation with origins in Dublin and an operational footprint that, at its peak, extended across Ireland, the United Kingdom, Spain, and the United Arab Emirates. Its principal figure, Daniel Kinahan, had been identified by Irish, British, and American law enforcement as the effective head of the organisation, directing its day-to-day operations remotely from Dubai. The cartel's activities encompassed the importation of cocaine and cannabis from South America and mainland Europe into Ireland and the UK, the movement of firearms, and the laundering of criminal proceeds through a network of businesses and intermediaries across multiple jurisdictions. The United States Treasury Department, in 2022, designated 6 members of the Kinahan organization under sanctions legislation and offered a reward of $5 million for information leading to the financial destruction of the group or the arrest and conviction of its leadership. It was one of the most significant law enforcement actions ever taken against an Irish criminal organization, and it was directed at a network that had, for years, been using British territory as a key component of its supply chain. Kavanagh's position within that network was not ambiguous. The NCA assessed him as the organization's main man in the UK. That phrase is a shorthand for a specific set of functions: identifying and managing importation routes into Britain, coordinating with European suppliers, overseeing the distribution of drugs once they had entered the country, and moving cash back out through whatever laundering channels were available. He had the seniority to make decisions without constant reference upward, and he had the operational infrastructure in Britain to execute those decisions. The motor dealership was not simply a cover story, it was a framework for explaining income and movement in a way that created surface legitimacy. He had been in Birmingham long enough, and had established enough of a business presence, that his lifestyle could be accounted for without obvious reference to drug trafficking. The Irish angle to Kavanagh's background is relevant to understanding how he ended up in Tamworth. He had 16 previous convictions in Ireland, including offences for assault, threats to kill, possession of firearms, and assaulting police officers. The Criminal Assets Bureau in Ireland had issued him with a substantial tax demand, a standard mechanism by which Irish authorities seek to recover unexplained wealth from organised crime figures. Facing that demand, and with a criminal history that made remaining in Ireland operationally difficult, he left and relocated to England in 2008. The move followed a pattern that the NCA would later identify as common among senior Kinahan associates, establishing themselves in English cities with sufficient distance from Irish law enforcement, while maintaining operational ties to the cartel through encrypted communications and trusted intermediaries. He was not hiding, he was reorganizing. Tamworth gave him a base, the motor dealership gave him a surface, and his position in the Kinahan hierarchy gave him access to a supply chain that operated on a continental scale. The investigation that would eventually dismantle his operation began with Irish police. In January 2017, the Garda Síochána made a number of arrests in Dublin and recovered a significant quantity of firearms and Class A drugs. The intelligence that emerged from those Dublin arrests pointed investigators toward a set of Midlands-based freight and logistics companies with connections to men in the Staffordshire and West Midlands areas. The NCA, which had been watching Kavanagh and his associates for roughly a year at that point, expanded its investigation in response. The connection being drawn was between the Irish arrests and an importation route into Britain that was using legitimate logistics infrastructure as cover. The method, when it was eventually exposed, was one of the more operationally sophisticated concealment techniques investigators had encountered. On the 2nd October 2017, a consignment was stopped and searched by NCA officers at the port of Dover. Inside the consignment, which had arrived from mainland Europe via standard freight channels, were two 6-ton industrial tarmac removal machines. The machines were large pieces of commercial equipment, the kind of heavy plant that moves through freight systems on a regular basis and that would attract no particular attention from routine customs inspections. They had been adapted. Secret compartments had been built into the structures of the machines, engineered to conceal cargo within the bulk of the equipment. When NCA officers searched the machines at Dover, they found 15 kilograms of cocaine and 200 kilograms of cannabis. The cocaine and cannabis had been transported across the channel inside tarmac removal machinery, moving as commercial freight, fitted with a tracking device that allowed the cartel to monitor the consignment's progress. The drugs had a street value assessed by investigators at approximately £30 million at UK prices. 3 men were arrested in direct connection with the Dover seizure. Gary Vickery was from Solihull, a business park town south of Birmingham. Daniel Canning was also from Solihull and was Vickery's brother-in-law. A third man, Martin Byrne, was an Irish national involved in the logistics side of the operation. Byrne died of cancer in August 2018 before any charges could be brought against him. Vickery and Canning were identified as sitting immediately beneath Kavanagh in the British operational hierarchy. Vickery was immediately beneath Kavanagh in seniority. Canning was subordinate to Vickery. The three had used Midlands-based freight and logistics companies to receive the adapted machinery and process the drugs through to distribution. An industrial unit in Wednesbury, in the West Midlands, had been searched by investigators and yielded a transformer that had itself been adapted for concealment. Inside a black holdall within the converted transformer, officers found a Smith & Wesson .357 revolver and 85 rounds of ammunition. Kavanagh himself was not arrested at Dover. He was arrested in January 2019, arriving at Birmingham Airport on a flight from outside the European Union. His son, who was in his early 20s, arrived on the same flight. Officers from the NCA, supported by the Garda Síochána and Staffordshire Police, moved on Kavanagh and his son simultaneously. His son was held on suspicion of money laundering and later released. Kavanagh was held on suspicion of conspiring to import and supply drugs, firearms and ammunition, and on suspicion of money laundering offences. The search of his Tamworth house produced the stun gun, the cash amounting to approximately £35,000, and the weapons including the knives, baseball bats and swords. The stun gun resulted in an initial 3-year sentence, while the major drug charges moved separately toward trial. Vickery and Canning, along with Kavanagh, all eventually pleaded guilty. The legal proceedings were delayed by a combination of factors: the COVID-19 pandemic, arguments over legal technicalities, and the need to extradite Vickery from Lanzarote, where he had been living, back to England to face sentencing. Legal arguments over the extradition process and over matters arising from the EncroChat intelligence operation that had been running in parallel added further delay. On 28 March 2022, at Ipswich Crown Court, the 3 men were sentenced. Kavanagh received 21 years for conspiracy to import Class A drugs, conspiracy to import Class B drugs, and money laundering. Vickery received 20 years for the same offences. Canning received 19 years and 6 months, with an additional admission of possessing a firearm and ammunition adding to the overall picture. The NCA estimated that the OCG had imported drugs with a UK street value of around £30 million through the British operation alone. The judge at sentencing noted that the 3 had conspired together with Martin Byrne, who was dead, and that a proceeds of crime hearing would follow. Kavanagh and Vickery were eventually ordered to repay a combined total of more than £1 million as part of those confiscation proceedings. Kavanagh was ordered to pay back the recoverable amount within 3 months, or face an additional 7 years in prison. What happened next illustrated something important about how senior organised crime figures think about institutional exposure, and how badly miscalculated responses to that exposure can go. While Kavanagh was in prison at HMP Dovegate, serving the 3-year sentence for the stun gun, while on remand awaiting the drug charges, he devised a plan to secure a reduction in the sentence he knew was coming. The plan involved acquiring a cache of weapons, concealing them in Northern Ireland, and then providing the NCA with the location, presenting himself as a cooperating source in a way that he hoped would be rewarded with a sentencing discount. He enlisted his son Jack, then 20 years old and working as a trainee accountant, his brother-in-law Liam Byrne from Dublin, and an associate named Sean Kent from Liverpool. 2 holdalls were hidden in a field in Newry, in Northern Ireland. When Kavanagh provided information to the NCA in May 2021 that led officers to the field, they found 7 machine guns, 3 automatic handguns, an assault rifle and ammunition. It appeared to investigators initially that Kavanagh was providing genuine intelligence. The prosecution later described it as a put-up job, a scheme in which the weapons had been acquired through Kavanagh's own criminal connections and planted specifically to create the appearance of cooperation, with no intention of providing any real assistance to law enforcement. The deception was uncovered because French and Dutch law enforcement agencies had cracked the EncroChat encrypted messaging platform in 2020 and passed the resulting intelligence to the NCA. Among the messages that investigators were able to read were communications that documented the planning and execution of the fake arms cash scheme. It was on those messages that the prosecution built its case. Kavanagh, Byrne, and Kent all admitted 2 charges of conspiring to possess a prohibited weapon and 2 charges of conspiring to possess prohibited ammunition. Kavanagh and Kent also admitted conspiring to pervert the course of justice. The court imposed an additional 6-year sentence on Kavanagh, to be served consecutively with the 21 years already handed down. His son Jack, who had been 20 years old when he became involved, avoided a custodial sentence. The judge in that subsequent case noted that Jack Kavanagh had been drawn into the scheme by his father and had been young at the time. The Kinahan cartel's exposure in the United Kingdom did not end with Kavanagh's sentencing. The broader organization continued to operate, and the US Treasury's 2022 designations against Daniel Kinahan, his father Christy, his brother Christopher, and 4 other associates reflected the assessment that the network remained functional at the leadership level despite the British convictions. Daniel Kinahan himself had been living in Dubai, where he had established himself partly in connection with the boxing world, having worked as an advisor to fighters including Tyson Fury and co-founded a management agency. Those connections generated significant public controversy in 2021 when Fury publicly thanked Kinahan for organizing a fight with then world champion Anthony Joshua. The public naming and the resulting scrutiny contributed to the pressure that accompanied the US sanctions announcement the following year. In August 2026, Kinahan was extradited from Dubai to Dublin, where he faced charges of directing an organized crime group. He arrived in Ireland on an Irish Air Corps plane and was taken directly to the Special Criminal Court. The British dimension of the Kinahan story is contained largely in Kavanagh's operation and its unravelling. What it shows is an organisation that understood how to use geographic separation from its Irish base, legitimate business infrastructure, and the complexity of multi-jurisdictional law enforcement to sustain a major importation operation for an extended period. The adapted tarmac machines at Dover were not improvised. They were engineered. The tracking device fitted to the consignment reflected a sophisticated understanding of supply chain management. Kavanagh's decade in Tamworth, building a motor dealership and establishing himself in a gated street in a prosperous English market town, was a carefully constructed operational position. The NCA had begun watching him in early 2016. It took until October 2017 to intercept the Dover consignment, and until 2022 to bring all 3 men to sentencing. The total investigation ran for approximately 6 years. The fake arms cash scheme, revealed through EncroChat intelligence, was the kind of miscalculation that happens when a man who has operated at a very high level of criminal sophistication tries to play a clever game inside an institution that already has him mapped. He received 27 years in total when the consecutive sentences were added together. The man who had been the Kinahan cartel's main man in the UK, who had lived in a fortified mansion in a Staffordshire market town and run a £30 million drug importation operation through tarmac machinery at Dover, will not be eligible for parole consideration for a very long time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. The next case built something different. Not an importation network, but a criminal enterprise that functioned like a corporation, with a CEO who paid his daughter's private school fees in cash envelopes left with the school receptionist. Section 4. Gregory Bell and the EncroChat generation. Gregory Bell paid his daughter's private school fees by walking into the school reception and leaving an envelope of cash on the desk. He did this repeatedly, on a recurring basis, at a school in Cheshire. He did not use bank transfers. He did not set up a standing order. He left cash, in person, with whoever happened to be at the front desk that day, and the school accepted it. It is a detail that sits at an odd intersection of the mundane and the criminal, and it tells something precise about how Bell understood the separation between his visible life and the reality underneath it. He had a daughter in private education, a house in one of Cheshire's most expensive villages, and no legitimate income capable of explaining either. What Bell had built, by the time investigators accessed his communications through the cracked EncroChat platform in 2020, was described in court as a criminal enterprise that reached into every corner of the United Kingdom. The detective inspector who led the investigation for Greater Manchester Police's Serious Organised Crime Division stated publicly that Bell was not simply a drug dealer, he was the head of a criminal enterprise. He operated, the court was told, like a CEO. That comparison was not rhetorical, it was structural. Bell managed logistics. He authorized deals, he set prices, coordinated deliveries, monitored the performance of his distribution network, and collected profits, all while maintaining a deliberate and carefully constructed distance from the physical handling of drugs. No court ever established Bell personally touching a kilogram of cocaine or heroin. That was the point. The entire architecture of his operation was designed to ensure that no direct connection between him and the product could be built through conventional surveillance. The EncroChat platform was the reason Bell believed that architecture was impenetrable. EncroChat was an encrypted communications service operating on specially modified handsets. The phones had no cameras, no GPS capability, and none of the standard features that allow a device to be located or surveilled. They communicated through an encrypted network with servers based in France, and the messages they carried were designed to be inaccessible to law enforcement. The devices had a factory reset function that could be triggered remotely, wiping all data instantly in the event of seizure. They were expensive, typically costing several £100s per handset, plus monthly subscription fees, and they were marketed almost exclusively to criminal networks. Europol later noted that the EncroChat network had approximately 50,000 users worldwide at the time of its takedown, and that the vast majority of traffic on the platform was criminal. It was, effectively, a private telecommunications network for organized crime. What French and Dutch law enforcement achieved in early 2020 was the technical infiltration of that network. The precise method used to penetrate the EncroChat servers has not been fully disclosed in public proceedings, but the outcome is a matter of legal record across hundreds of British prosecutions. From approximately March to June 2020, investigators were reading the messages passing through the platform in something close to real time. They were inside the private communications of tens of thousands of criminals who believed they were operating beyond the reach of any law enforcement agency on Earth. The operation that the NCA led in the United Kingdom in response to that intelligence was called Operation Venetic. By August 2025, Greater Manchester Police alone had made 269 arrests under Venetic, with 215 individuals sentenced to a combined total of more than 2,120 years in prison. Across Britain as a whole, more than 2,200 criminals had been convicted. Bell was among the last of GMP's major Venetic targets to be sentenced. He appeared at Manchester Crown Court on the 20th October 2025 and received 18 years and 9 months. Bell operated behind 3 EncroChat handles. The names he had chosen for himself on the platform were Castle Snail, Radio Reno, and Wonky Frog. Users of the system chose their own handles, and the names individuals selected often reflected either an attempt at deliberate obscurity or a kind of private humor. Wonky Frog is not the name of a serious man conducting serious business, and that gap between the handle and the reality of what it represented illustrates how thoroughly these criminals had convinced themselves that the encryption made them untouchable. Bell was referred to in the messages by his associates as the boss and the gaffer. The messages showed him giving instructions, negotiating prices, and coordinating deliveries with what investigators described as precision. His phone's contact list contained more than 70 names of drug suppliers and customers spread across the United Kingdom. The physical infrastructure of Bell's operation centered on 2 safe houses and a fleet of vehicles adapted for concealment. The addresses were on Moss Lane in Alderley Edge, Cheshire, and on Coniston Drive in Bury, Greater Manchester. Couriers would collect from those addresses and move the drugs in vehicles fitted with secret compartments built specifically for the purpose. The compartments were not improvised, they were engineered into the vehicles. When police found a black suitcase with a yellow trim at one of the stash houses, it contained 2 brown packages taped over. The suitcase was the kind of physical exhibit that, when placed alongside months of encrypted messages directing its delivery, closes the gap between a principle and a product in court with precision. The network of associates Bell used stretched across multiple regions and involved individuals who each played a defined role within the hierarchy. Christopher Watson, from Oldham, operated under the handle Tabuemu. His function was as a trusted courier, transporting drugs and cash across the country and reporting directly to Bell. In his own messages, he referred to Bell consistently as the boss, a form of direct attribution that is unusually clean as criminal evidence goes. He was sentenced in July 2023 to 16 years and 6 months for conspiracy to supply Class A and B drugs and money laundering. David Williams, operating under the handle Ho Ho Ho, delivered drugs and collected payments. He too called Bell the boss in his communications and received 12 years. Kane O'Keefe, operating as Stark Forest from Ashton-under-Lyne, was jailed for 12 years for the same conspiracies. Ian Ogden presented a more complex picture within the network. Ogden, who used the handles Tubbyturn and Integral Rhino, was not simply a subordinate within Bell's organization. He ran his own independent drug business in parallel with his role inside Bell's structure, arranging deals and managing his own logistics while simultaneously working with Bell's network. The coexistence of his independent operation and his conspiratorial role illustrates something the EncroChat evidence revealed consistently across many Venetic prosecutions. The criminal economy at the wholesale level is not cleanly hierarchical. Senior figures maintain their own operations while holding lateral relationships with other operators, sharing supply when it is mutually useful. Ogden received 16 years and 8 months for conspiracy to supply Class A and B drugs and money laundering. A further associate, identified in court documents as Brown, of Failsworth, occupied a key distribution role and fled the United Kingdom when the EncroChat takedown made clear that investigators were closing in. He was located in Spain in 2024, following what the NCA described as an extensive international manhunt, arrested and extradited back to Britain to complete the sentencing of Bell's entire identified OCG. The process of finding and returning a fugitive who had been in Spain for 4 years required sustained effort across 2 law enforcement agencies and the formal extradition process between 2 countries. It took 4 years. He came back. Bell's own arrest and the path to his sentencing ran through the standard Venetic timeline. French and Dutch investigators had infiltrated EncroChat in early 2020 and shared the resulting intelligence with the NCA. Bell's device gave investigators access to his communications across the March to June 2020 window, roughly 3 months during which he continued to conduct business on a platform he had no reason to believe was compromised. During those 3 months, he conducted the full range of his operations in the open, as he always had. Supply arrangements with multiple wholesalers, pricing negotiations, logistics coordination with couriers, instructions for the management of the 2 safe houses, financial oversight across a network of more than 70 suppliers and customers spanning the country, all of it recorded in messages he believed were protected by military-grade encryption and captured in full by French authorities who had already broken that encryption months earlier. The private school detail operates on 2 levels simultaneously, and neither of them is incidental. On the practical level, cash payments to a school generate no financial record that is accessible to HMRC or law enforcement. A bank transfer above certain thresholds triggers reporting requirements. A cash envelope left at a reception desk triggers nothing. It allowed Bell to fund a specific and visible element of his lifestyle without creating a paper trail that investigators could follow. On the second level, it reflects how Bell understood the relationship between his criminal operation and his family life. He was not hiding his family from his criminality or his criminality from his family. Both existed in the same life simultaneously, each one requiring maintenance. The drug network generated the income. The income funded the village house, the school fees, the surface of prosperity. The surface of prosperity was the thing that had to remain coherent because it was the only visible layer of the arrangement. The court heard that Bell managed everything while keeping total distance from the physical product. Distance is the central operating principle of any principle running a network at scale, and EncroChat had appeared to solve the communication problem that distance creates. Without a secure platform, directing a national drug distribution operation requires phone calls that can be intercepted, messages that can be recovered, meetings that can be observed. EncroChat appeared to eliminate all 3 exposure points simultaneously. The handles made the user anonymous. The encryption made the content unreadable. The remote wipe made the device clean on seizure. Bell used it, in the words of his investigating officer, to move vast quantities of drugs and launder millions of pounds while living in a Cheshire village and leaving cash envelopes at a school reception. What the EncroChat takedown demonstrated, across all 2,000-plus phonetic convictions, is that the technological solution to the exposure problem was never as complete as its users believed. Every handset had the remote wipe function, but the wipe only worked if it was triggered before investigators had already copied the data from the servers. The infiltration of those servers meant that the messages had been captured before any wipe was ever relevant. Bell's 3 months of communications were already in the hands of investigators before anyone in his network understood the platform had been compromised. The server takedown in June 2020 triggered the remote wipe across the world, but the intelligence was already categorized, attributed, and ready for prosecution. The wipe wiped nothing that mattered. He is currently serving 18 years and 9 months. His daughter's private school fees are no longer being paid in cash envelopes left with the reception desk. The safe houses, the adapted vehicles, and the network of more than 70 suppliers and customers, documented across 3 months of captured messages, have all been subject to ongoing investigation and enforcement. Bell was 43 years old at sentencing. He will be in his late 50s before any parole consideration becomes possible. The Wonky Frog handle, the Castle Snail alias, the Radio Reno identity, all of them resolved to the same man in a Cheshire village who thought encryption made him invisible and found out, via a French server room, that it did not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next man on this list built something older and more dire, a criminal feudal state run from a single estate, where the threat was personal, the corruption ran into the police force itself, and the revenge killing that ended his reign happened. Section 5. Colin Gunn and the Bestwood Estate. Colin Gunn started with cheque fraud. In the 1980s, a Nottinghamshire officer described him as average, run-of-the-mill, a petty criminal, landing short sentences for minor offences. That assessment would age badly. By the time Gunn was convicted in 2006, he had built a criminal organisation that controlled drug distribution and extortion across an entire residential estate in North Nottingham. Corrupted officers inside the force investigating him ordered the murders of 2 people who had no criminal record, and created conditions so hostile to ordinary life that residents described being afraid to leave their homes. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 35 years. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until 2040. The minimum term is the court's formal acknowledgement of what he built and what it cost. The Bestwood Cartel, as investigators and courts came to call it, was built jointly by Colin and his brother David through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Extortion was its foundation. The brothers collected payments from local shops, pubs and clubs on the Bestwood estate, and the arrangement was the standard one: payment bought protection, which in practice meant protection from the people collecting the payment. The drug operation ran alongside the extortion. Heroin and cocaine moved through the estate under the Gunn family's control, generating income that the extortion payments supplemented. Between those 2 revenue streams and the violence that enforced both, the brothers built a position of dominance over the estate that operated, functionally, as private governance. The laws that applied on Bestwood were the Gunn's laws. The consequences for breaking them were the Gunn's consequences. Colin Gunn had been using steroids for more than a decade by the early 2000s and was also consuming cocaine regularly. The combination produced something that former associates described consistently in terms of unpredictability and extreme violence. He craved the sight of fear. He took satisfaction in causing pain. Enemies were beaten with baseball bats. Men who crossed the organization were doused in petrol and threatened with being set alight. A man suspected of cooperating with police was taken to a remote location outside Bestwood and subjected to treatment that investigators received partial accounts of, but never fully established in court. These were not impulsive acts. They were calculated applications of terror, designed to maintain the fear that the entire operation rested on. Every person on the estate who knew what happened to people who stepped out of line was, by that knowledge, part of the enforcement mechanism. The violence did not need to be constant, because the memory of it was constant. By 2001, sources within Nottinghamshire Police were acknowledging something that would only become a formal matter of legal record years later. Gunn had developed an intelligence network about police operations that in some respects outperformed what investigators had about him. The reform of informant regulations during that period had placed new constraints on how officers could manage and run sources. Gunn operated under no equivalent constraint. He was recruiting actively, building relationships with people who had access to information from inside the force, and receiving that information through go-betweens in ways that insulated him from direct contact with the source. Investigators launched undercover operations against him. The warning that circulated among officers working those operations was explicit. If Gunn ever identified an undercover officer on the estate, that officer would be taken from the street and tortured to death. Former undercover officer Neil Woods, who worked in Nottingham and surrounding areas between 1993 and 2007 and attempted to penetrate Gunn's operation, described him publicly as one of the most vicious gangsters he had encountered across 14 years. He used the word thug and meant it as a precise description of someone who had elevated physical terror into an operational method. The corruption of police officers was not peripheral to Gunn's operation. It was structural. The information he received through compromised sources gave him advance notice of surveillance, warned him when specific individuals were being watched, and allowed him to adjust his activities in response to investigative pressure. After his conviction, he was also found guilty of corrupting police, the mechanism being his use of go-betweens to route confidential information from officers within the Nottinghamshire force into his hands. The full extent of what was communicated to him over the years, and the precise number of officers involved, has never been comprehensively detailed in public, but the conviction stands. He had intelligence assets inside the institution, charged with dismantling him. In 2003, newspapers began applying specific language to Nottingham. Assassination City was one phrase that appeared in national coverage. Gun crime capital of the UK was another. Both arose from an accumulation of events across the estate and its surrounding areas, of which the killing of Marion Bates drew the most sustained national attention. Bates was 64 years old and ran the Time Centre jewellery shop on Front Street in Arnold. In September 2003, armed men entered the shop. Bates was shot dead while attempting to protect her daughter from the attackers. She was killed in her own premises, in front of her own daughter, in the middle of the day. Craig Moran, who had been part of the Bestwood criminal network, was jailed for 13 years for plotting the raid. He did not pull the trigger, he organised the operation. He was released in April 2017, at which point the story of what happens when the vacuum left by Gunn is filled by someone who came up inside his world becomes relevant. That story ends with a 24-year sentence, and it will be dealt with in its proper sequence. The killing that defined the outer limit of what Gunn was willing to authorize arose not from a business dispute or a territorial challenge, but from a chain of personal grievance rooted in a death within his circle. A young man associated with the Gunn family had died, and the account that reached police and eventually became established in court proceedings was that Joan Sterland's son, Michael O'Brien, bore responsibility. Gunn's response to that connection was the decision that ended his freedom permanently. John and Joan Sterland were not criminals. They were ordinary people on the edges of a world they had not chosen. After shots were fired at their home on the estate, they had fled Nottingham and moved to a bungalow in Trusthorpe on the Lincolnshire coast, believing the distance had made them safe. They were wrong, and the fact that they had tried to escape was not something Gunn treated as a reason to leave them alone. In August 2004, gunmen travelled to Trusthorpe and shot both of them inside their bungalow. John Sterland, 55 years old, was shot 6 times. Joan Sterland, 51, was shot 4 times. The prosecution at Gunn's trial established the conspiracy. 2 other men were convicted for their physical roles in the killing. Michael McNee, 21 at the time, received a minimum of 25 years. John Russell, 29, received 30 years. Gunn was convicted of conspiracy to murder and received a life sentence with the 35-year minimum in 2006. He was 46 years old at sentencing. The logic of targeting John and Joan Sterland rather than their son carries its own grim internal coherence, and it is worth understanding rather than simply noting. O'Brien was not as accessible. The Sterlands had left Nottingham, were living quietly on the coast, and the very fact that they had distanced themselves from the situation made them reachable in a way that a man who might have been watchful and alert was not. There was also a communicative function to the choice. A killing directed at a son's parents rather than at the son himself is a message of a specific kind. It says that proximity to an act against the organization is sufficient to make anyone in your family a viable target. That message, once sent, does not need to be repeated. Everyone who heard what happened in Trusthorpe understood the implication. The years between Gunn's sentencing and the present have produced a sustained institutional effort to manage his continuing capacity to extend influence from inside the prison system. In 2010, intelligence reached the prison service that he had formulated a plan described as daring and viable to escape from his then current facility. He was transferred to HMP Belmarsh, the highest security prison in England. Intelligence during that period also established that he had arranged for a fellow inmate to pass a note to a prison officer. The note carried the address of the officer's disabled brother and the message that the officer now worked for Gunn. It was intercepted. The incident confirmed for the prison service that Gunn's capacity to attempt to project authority into the institution around him had not been diminished by imprisonment, and that managing him required structural containment rather than standard protocols. His lawyers challenged his placement conditions at Belmarsh on human rights grounds, arguing that the restrictions interfered with his right to family life. The High Court dismissed the argument. Mr. Justice Bean found the decision to place him in high security conditions had been reasonable. Gunn was ordered to pay £1,000 toward the government's legal costs. He later held at HMP Long Lartin in Evesham, where he challenged his classification as a high escape risk in separate proceedings. Those proceedings also went against him. A man who had spent nearly a decade using corrupted police intelligence to stay ahead of investigators was finding that the prison estate's mechanisms for managing him were more resilient than those of the institution he had previously compromised. What Gunn left behind on the estate when he was convicted was a power vacuum of significant consequence. Nottinghamshire police launched Operation Kingdom on the estate in the aftermath of the prosecution, a sustained targeting of crime and antisocial behaviour. In the year 2005 to 2006, 1,245 crimes were recorded on Bestwood. By 2009 to 2010, that figure had fallen to 676, a reduction of 46%. A resident quoted in contemporary coverage described life before Operation Kingdom in unambiguous terms. People were afraid to go outside and lived their lives behind closed doors. The 46% reduction in crime is a precise measure of what the removal of a single criminal organization from a defined geographic area can produce. It is also a measure of what that organization had been costing the people who lived under it. The vacuum was never permanently empty. Kane Price, from the Bestwood area of Nottingham, established a drugs line called R1 while already serving a sentence at Lincoln Prison, using a mobile phone to organize shipments of Class A drugs back into Nottingham from inside a cell. His associate Rhys Houghton, who worked as a barber, ran the operational end, sending bulk text messages to hundreds of addicts to advertise when heroin, cocaine, and crack cocaine were available. Officers who raided the barber's shop found scales with cocaine residue and a diary containing the numbers of drug dealers. Price received 12 years. Houghton received 7 years and 4 months. The estate Gunn had controlled through personal terror and systematic corruption continued to generate criminal enterprise after his removal, through different hands, at smaller scale, without his specific combination of intelligence access and calculated violence. But it continued. Craig Moran's trajectory, after his 2017 release from the 13-year sentence for the Marion Bates robbery plot, is the clearest illustration of what that vacuum looked like when someone with Bestwood roots and criminal ambition tried to fill it at scale. He built a drug operation connecting Manchester and Nottingham, moving cocaine, heroin, and cannabis between the two cities through a network that a Nottingham Crown Court judge would later describe as a highly sophisticated criminal cartel operating at the very top of the scale of seriousness. When the net began closing in 2018, Moran fled to the United Arab Emirates. Dubai police monitored him before arresting him in his car as he left his accommodation. He was extradited back to the UK. At Nottingham Crown Court, he received 24 years. The judge drew a comparison to a mid-table Premier League football club, substantial, organised, professional, but not the thing Gunn had built. Gunn had built something that required corrupting the institutions supposed to stop it, that had run a residential estate under private law for over a decade, and that sent 2 people with no criminal history to their deaths on the Lincolnshire coast because of something their son had done. The 46% crime reduction after his conviction is one measure of what it meant. John and Joan Sterland are the other. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gunn's power ran through fear and a corrupted police force. The next man operated with none of that. No territory, no corruption, no physical presence in Britain at all. Just a villa in Marbella, 2 EncroChat handles, and 1.1 tons of cocaine moving through a parcel depot in Essex. Section 6. Stephen Bullen and the £109 million network. Stephen Bullen solved the principal's problem by removing himself from the country entirely. While his cocaine moved through a parcel depot in Essex, through the hands of a corrupted UPS employee, and out into the distribution networks of organised crime groups across Britain, Bullen was in a villa in Marbella. He was not directing his operation through intermediaries or through a layer of trusted lieutenants who absorbed the exposure risk, while he sat at a safe distance within the same jurisdiction. He was in Spain. The drugs were in England. The connection between the two existed only inside the encrypted messages of a communications platform that he believed, until French authorities proved otherwise, was mathematically impossible to penetrate. He operated under the handles Domestic Car and Rocket Spark, referred to himself and his associates elsewhere on the platform under names including Veggie Cray and Ghost, and across a 10-month window between August 2019 and May 2020, imported 1.1 tons of cocaine from the Netherlands into the United Kingdom. The network those drugs fed was valued by the National Crime Agency at £109 million. On 9 July 2026, at Southwark Crown Court, Bullen received 16 years and 4 months. He was 51 years old. The EncroChat platform gave Bullen something that previous generations of British drug traffickers operating from Spain had not had access to: a communications infrastructure that appeared to compress the operational distance between a principal abroad and a network at home into something manageable. Earlier operators running drug empires from the Costa del Sol had to work through phone calls that could be intercepted, through intermediaries who created human exposure points at every link in the chain, through the physical transfer of instructions across borders that left trails. EncroChat appeared to eliminate all of that. Bullen could negotiate prices, arrange importation schedules, manage the movement of money, and direct his distribution network from his villa in Marbella as though he were sitting in the same room as the people carrying out his instructions. The encryption meant the content of those conversations was unreadable. The handles meant his identity was concealed. The remote wipe function meant the device could be cleaned instantly on seizure. He had, in the architecture of that platform, what appeared to be perfect operational cover for running a 9-figure criminal enterprise from a Spanish villa. The entry point for the cocaine was a UPS parcel depot in Stanford-le-Hope, Essex. Stanford-le-Hope is a town on the Thames estuary, positioned close enough to the major container port infrastructure of the Essex and Kent coast to sit naturally within the logistics geography that commercial importation uses. The depot processed large volumes of parcels arriving from the Netherlands and elsewhere, and within that volume the individual packages carrying cocaine were, by design, indistinguishable from legitimate freight. Zach Archbold was 30 years old, from Braintree, and worked at the Stanford-le-Hope depot as a manager overseeing a team responsible for sorting incoming packages. That position gave him 2 things that made him valuable to Bullen's operation. He knew which parcels were scheduled to be inspected by Border Force officers, and he had the authority and access to direct specific packages onto particular lorries and away from inspection. He was, in the language of Bullen's EncroChat messages, the king. The mechanism Archbold used was straightforward in its conception and required no exotic technical knowledge. He managed the sorting team. He knew the inspection schedule. When parcels carrying cocaine arrived at the depot from the Netherlands, Archbold identified them, swapped their labels to redirect them away from Border Force scrutiny, and ensured they moved through the facility without examination. He helped Bullen move approximately 28 such parcels through the depot, each containing up to 12 kilograms of cocaine. For each kilogram successfully delivered, he received £750. The gang paid approximately £2,000 per kilogram for the cocaine at the point of importation, meaning that Archbold's fee represented a significant slice of the margin on each kilo, but a margin that the operation could sustain given the volume being moved and the efficiency the arrangement provided. Without Archbold's position and access, the entire importation route through Stanford-le-Hope was impossible. He was not a peripheral figure, he was infrastructure. The drug was arriving from the Netherlands, which has functioned as the primary European transit hub for South American cocaine entering Northern Europe for decades. The Dutch port infrastructure, and particularly Rotterdam, processes an enormous volume of legitimate commercial freight, and the challenge of identifying drug shipments within that volume has occupied law enforcement agencies across the continent throughout the modern era of cocaine trafficking. Bullen's route exploited the same basic principle that every successful importation network exploits. The ratio of drug cargo to legitimate cargo is small enough that, without specific intelligence or a corrupted insider at the point of entry, the probability of interception on any individual shipment is low. Archbold's role reduced that probability further to something approaching zero on the shipments he was managing. The 28 parcels moved through Stanford-La Hope without a single interception while he was actively involved. The EncroChat messages that investigators recovered after the platform's takedown documented the full range of Bullen's ambitions, which extended considerably beyond the cocaine importation route. Within the messages, officers found photographs of ledgers detailing prices of cocaine and ecstasy that Bullen was supplying. The ledgers were meticulous, the kind of record-keeping that reflects a man who understood his operation as a commercial enterprise with margins, costs, and inventory that needed tracking. The messages also showed that Bullen had conspired to supply 410 kilograms of the cocaine he had imported, with a street value assessed at £32.8 million, and 242 kilograms of ecstasy, with a street value of £9.68 million. Those figures relate specifically to the supply side of the operation rather than the importation side, and together they account for a substantial portion of the £109 million total network valuation. Amphetamine production featured in the messages as a planned expansion. Bullen discussed recipes for producing what his messages referred to as trainers, which was the slang his network used for amphetamine, and detailed the quantities of precursor chemicals he had access to. Officers who analyzed that material calculated that the chemicals Bullen had identified access to were sufficient to produce 2,250 kilograms of amphetamine, with a street value of £11.25 million. That production had not been fully realized by the time the EncroChat platform was taken down in June 2020, but its presence in the messages, as a concrete operational plan, rather than an abstract aspiration, reflects the scale of what Bullen was building. The cocaine importation network was not the ceiling of his ambitions. It was the established operation from which he was planning to expand. 3 men identified in the proceedings as Benjamin Thake, Craig Merrin, and Jura Faber were linked to the network through the EncroChat evidence, but had not been arrested at the time of Bullen's sentencing. Their status as individuals still at large was noted in court proceedings. The existence of 3 named co-conspirators not yet in custody is a reminder that the EncroChat takedown, for all the convictions it produced, did not reach everyone connected to every network it documented. Some individuals managed to avoid the immediate sweep of Operation Venetic and its national equivalents. The NCA and its partner agencies have continued pursuing individuals named in the intelligence. The investigation that identified Bullen as the person behind the domestic car and rocket spark handles required months of analytical work by NCA officers. The EncroChat platform was designed to prevent exactly that kind of identification. The handles created identity separation between the criminal and their digital presence, and without additional evidence connecting a specific individual to a specific handle, the messages alone could not establish who had sent them. What broke the anonymity was the messages themselves. Within the communications traffic attributed to domestic car and rocket spark, officers found a photograph of Bullen's villa. The photograph had been shared through the platform in a context that was operational rather than personal, but it was specific enough to allow investigators, working with the Spanish National Police, to identify the property in Marbella. Once the villa was identified, the process of connecting the property to Bullen as its occupant was a matter of standard investigative procedure. Spanish authorities placed him under surveillance in the period that followed. On 8 April 2025, Bullen was arrested in Spain. Officers seized multiple devices during the raid on his villa and recovered approximately 250 spreadsheets detailing drug sales and payments. The spreadsheets were the paper trail that the EncroChat messages had initiated and that Bullen's own record-keeping had completed. A man who had taken considerable care to separate his physical presence from his criminal operation had simultaneously maintained detailed written records of that operation's financial performance. The spreadsheets closed the remaining distance between the messages and the man. He was extradited to the United Kingdom and pleaded guilty to all charges. Archbold had been identified through a different route. When UPS conducted an internal investigation into irregularities at the Stanford-La Hope depot, Archbold was interviewed and told his employer that he had been involved in stealing parcels. The parcel theft explanation accounted for some of the anomalies without exposing the drug importation. UPS suspended him following the internal investigation. When NCA investigators, working through the EncroChat intelligence, reached the point in their analysis where Bullen's messages referred to a corrupt UPS manager called King, they had an existing investigation at Stanford La Hope to cross-reference against. The suspension, the timing, the depot location, and the operational details in the messages converged on Archbold. He was arrested, and the cover story he had provided to his employer collapsed against the specificity of what the EncroChat messages contained. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 12 years alongside Bullen at Southwark Crown Court on 9 July 2026. The specific structure of Bullen's operation is worth examining against the broader history of British drug trafficking that this video has traced, because it represents a model that had evolved considerably from what earlier principles had used. Warren had moved to the Netherlands to manage his operation, placing himself at the continental hub of European drug distribution. Kavanagh had stayed in Britain, using a fortified house in Tamworth as his base and freight logistics as his importation method. Bullen had gone further than either. He was in Spain, communicating through a platform whose servers were in France, importing through the Netherlands, using a corrupt insider at a British logistics depot to manage the final entry point, and maintaining detailed financial records on a device in a Spanish villa. The layers of geographic and institutional separation between him and the product were more numerous than anything the previous generation of British traffickers had managed. The operation was also, in the end, dismantled by the same mechanism as every EncroChat network. The platform's encryption was broken before anyone inside it knew the breach had happened, and the messages that had been written in confidence were read by investigators who had been waiting, quietly, for the information to accumulate. £750 per kilogram for Archbold, £2,000 per kilogram at the point of importation, £88 million street value for the cocaine that moved through Stanford La Hope between August 2019 and May 2020, 250 spreadsheets found in a villa in Marbella, 16 years and 4 months at Southwark Crown Court, 12 years for the man at the depot, 3 co-conspirators still at large. Bullen had built something sophisticated, profitable, and, for the period it ran, largely invisible to the authorities looking for it. What undid it was not an informant, not a traffic stop, not a physical surveillance operation. It was a photograph of a villa sent through an encrypted app that French intelligence agencies had already cracked, to a handle that NCA officers spent months painstakingly connecting to a man sitting in the Marbella sun who believed the mathematics of encryption had made him permanently safe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bullen's operation had no street presence, no territory, no violence. The next model is the opposite, a system that put drugs into the hands of addicts in every town and city in Britain by recruiting the youngest, the most vulnerable, and the most easily discarded people in the country to carry them there. Section 7. County Lines and the Industrial Model. County Lines is not the name of a gang, it is the name of a business model. And understanding what made it the dominant form of British drug distribution for the better part of a decade requires understanding it as a system rather than as a collection of individual criminal acts. The phone line is where the name comes from. A single mobile number, advertised to users in a target area, serves as the ordering mechanism for a drug supply operation run by people who are physically located somewhere else entirely. The line crosses county boundaries. The gang in the city holds the line. The people they have placed in the target area handle the dealing. The addicts call the number, place their order, and wait. The model is old enough in its basic logic. Drug dealing has always required a customer to contact a seller, but the specific configuration that County Lines describes, the central phone number, the urban gang, the provincial target market, the exploited runners, became the dominant structure of British retail drug supply during the 2010s and has not been displaced since. The scale of what that model produced is visible in the aggregate figures that law enforcement has published over the years. The NCA, estimating conservatively, identified at least 720 active county lines across England and Wales. Each line, on average, generates between £3,000 and £5,000 per day. That range, applied across 720 lines, produces a daily criminal income somewhere between £2.1 million and £3.6 million from county lines activity alone, before accounting for the lines that generate above the average. The UK cocaine market as a whole was assessed by the NCA at up to £11.8 billion annually, and cocaine consumption had increased by approximately 290% between 2011 and the late 2010s. County lines sat within that expansion as both a product of it and an accelerant of it. The model made drugs available in places they had previously been difficult to access. Availability created demand. Demand justified the investment in building more lines. The human cost of that model is concentrated at its base. Children as young as 11 have been identified by law enforcement as being recruited into county lines roles. Research commissioned by the Mayor of London identified more than 4,000 individuals recruited by gangs during a single study period, of whom 46% were aged between 15 and 19, and 89% were male. The youngest identified nationally were 11 years old. The roles these individuals were placed in covered a range of functions within the operational structure. Couriers trafficked drugs between the urban base and the provincial market. Runners delivered drugs to customers once they arrived in the target area. Sitters occupied cuckooed properties and managed the dealing environment from inside. Each function carried its own specific exposure and risk, and each was filled by someone who was either too young to fully understand what they were agreeing to, desperate enough to accept the risk as worth taking, or controlled through a debt bondage arrangement that gave them no practical choice. Cuckooing is the process by which county lines gangs establish a base in the target area without renting a property. The word derives from the nesting behavior of cuckoo birds, which place their eggs in the nests of other species and allow those species to bear the cost and risk of incubation. In county lines terms, cuckooing involves identifying a vulnerable individual in the target area, typically someone with a drug dependency, a physical disability, severe mental health problems, or elderly isolation, and taking over their home to use as a base for drug preparation and dealing. The resident may be coerced outright, they may be paid in drugs, they may accept the arrangement because the alternative, refusal, carries a more immediate threat than the presence of the gang. The occupier of the cuckooed address is simultaneously a victim of the operation and, in some cases, a participant in it. And the legal and safeguarding complexity of that dual status has challenged both police and social services in every area where the model has operated. Recorded cuckooing incidents in London alone rose from 79 in 2018 to 316 in 2022, a fourfold increase across 4 years. Dean Beaton was 37 years old and from Watford when he was sentenced to 27 years at Kingston Crown Court in January 2020. He had run a cocaine distribution operation across London and the South East that was generating approximately £2.7 million per week at its peak, and had supplied a quantity of cocaine that the sentencing judge described as a conservative estimate of 1 metric ton. The operation ran between December 2016 and January 2018, a period of roughly 13 months. The cocaine arrived from the West Midlands in cardboard boxes, transported over at least 38 separate trips to safe houses around London, from which runners distributed it across the capital and beyond, to county lines, networks and dealers working smaller markets. The purity of the product was 90%, which is unusually high for cocaine at the distribution level, and reflects sourcing from a wholesaler operating at the top of the supply chain. At that purity level, each kilogram Beaton's network received could be cut multiple times before reaching the end user, multiplying the profit margin at every stage between arrival and sale. The element of Beaton's operation that distinguished it from other large-scale distribution networks was its reliance on Giovanni Luciano, who was 33 years old and already serving a 9-year sentence for cocaine supply when he became one of the central figures in the conspiracy. Luciano was held at Ford Prison in West Sussex, an open-conditions facility that, by the standards of the closed prison estate, offered considerably more opportunity for communication with the outside world. Less than halfway through his sentence, he exploited the relative freedom of those open conditions to use an encrypted mobile phone that had been smuggled into the prison. From his cell, he coordinated the sale of wholesale quantities of cocaine to dealers and county lines networks across London and beyond, managing logistics, negotiating prices, and directing couriers through the encrypted device. The phone was the operational center of that part of the network. The prison cell was its office. Luciano received 17 years for his role in the conspiracy, to be served after the completion of his existing sentence. Beaton himself used at least 21 pay-as-you-go phones and 4 heavily encrypted devices to orchestrate the wider operation. The volume of communications infrastructure reflects the operational principle that drives it. A criminal principal who speaks to everyone through a single phone creates a single point of compromise, and a single interception ends the operation. By distributing communication across 25 separate devices, Beaton created a situation in which the seizure of any one device gave investigators only a fragment of the picture. The full network required investigators to connect those fragments through analytical work rather than through a single decisive interception. 6 other members of the gang were sentenced alongside Beaton and Luciano at Kingston Crown Court, with the 7 receiving a combined total of 111 years. The wider investigation that surrounded the case resulted in approximately 100 criminals across 20 drug distribution networks being brought to justice, with custodial sentences across those cases totaling more than 800 years. Kane Morris McGibbon was 26 years old and from South London when he was sentenced at Cardiff Crown Court. He was known by the name Goldie, and the drug line his organisation ran into Bridgend in South Wales carried that name. The Goldie line operated between October 2018 and May 2019, a period of 7 months, during which the group was responsible for selling 3.29 kilograms of heroin and crack cocaine through a cuckooed property in the town of Pencode. Menna Thomas, who lived in Pencode and whose premises were used as the base for the operation, was convicted of drugs trafficking offences alongside Goldie and his associates, and sentenced to 6 years and 6 months. The property in Pencode served as the preparation and storage point from which the drugs were distributed to users across the Bridgend area. Morris McGibbon controlled the entire operation from South London, with 2 associates trafficking the drugs from the capital to Wales and managing the on-the-ground dealing. He had also, in the course of running the operation, trafficked a 16-year-old boy to work as part of his drug-dealing enterprise. That element of the case resulted in a specific trafficking offence alongside the drugs charges. He received 11 years and 6 months. The London to Exeter County Lines operation that was prosecuted at Exeter Crown Court illustrated a different dimension of how the model exploits the young. The gang was selling up to £10,000 of drugs per week to users in Exeter and moving the money back to London. The people they had placed in Exeter to manage the dealing included children as young as 13. The judge at the sentencing described the operation as a despicable trade. Devon and Cornwall police, in their characterisation of the group, stated that the gang had preyed on children to undertake drug running and cash collection. The gang members had filmed themselves on Snapchat during drug runs and shared the footage, including videos in which they flaunted large quantities of cash, and stated that the police could never defeat them. The bravado of that footage is a consistent feature of county lines prosecutions across Britain. Young men who have been placed in a position of street authority for the first time in their lives, in a town they have been sent to from a city, filming themselves in a way that is partly swagger and partly an implicit admission that the lifestyle is not expected to last. The footage became exhibit material at their trial. Siphone Cube was 29 years old when he was jailed for 15 years as a leading member of a Nottinghamshire County Lines network that was eventually sentenced to a combined 130 years. The gang ran 13 separate drug lines from a city base into Nottinghamshire towns including Sutton in Ashfield, Mansfield and Hucknall, as well as operations reaching into Grantham and Spalding in Lincolnshire, Long Eaton, Ripley and Ilkeston in Derbyshire, and Colville in Leicestershire. A further line connected with the gang was found to be active as far north as Aberdeen. 13 lines, operating simultaneously, reaching into 5 English counties and Scotland, run from a single criminal network. The geographic spread of that operation illustrates how the county lines model had, by the time of that prosecution, become genuinely national rather than merely regional. Handwritten notes recovered from N-Cube documented his stated target, £20,000 per week, from his personal share of the dealing income. He had been found in possession of Rolex watches and designer clothing. He had been repeatedly found carrying knives. He continued to offend while on bail following earlier arrests, reflecting the calculation that the income the lines generated was worth the risk of the additional offending while the prosecution was pending. Jefty Fikula, another senior member of the same network, received 21 years. The court heard that officers had found firearms when they raided properties associated with him. Linford Good ran a county lines operation, supplying crack cocaine and heroin to dealers and users in Swindon and Marlborough, while already on licence from a 10-year sentence for county lines dealing into Norwich. The Swindon and Marlborough operation was contacted by more than 800 individual phone numbers during the course of the conspiracy. When police raided his house, they found a Rolex watch valued at £21,000 and £20,000 in cash. He issued violent threats to people who owed him money, including to members of his own network. His associate ran the drug shipments from London to Wiltshire while driving luxury cars. The detail of being on licence from a previous county lines sentence while running a new county lines operation is not unusual within the prosecutorial record. The structural economics of the model creates strong incentives for experienced operators to resume as quickly as possible after release, and the absence of any meaningful legitimate alternative income for men who have spent years inside the system makes the resumption of the same activity the path of least resistance. What connects Beaton's operation to Goldie's line, to the Exeter gang, to N-Cube's 13-line Nottinghamshire network is not geography or scale or the specific drugs being sold. What connects them is the architecture, the urban hub, the phone line, the provincial market, the exploited person at the delivery end. The model is consistent because it works. It distributes the risk across the network by placing the most exposed individuals, the runners, the cuckooed property occupants, the children carrying the packages, at the bottom of a hierarchy whose principles are as far from the product as the network's communications allow. A child carrying drugs on a train between London and Exeter is not the person who owns the line. The person who owns the line is in London, managing 21 phones, sending the child. The child gets arrested. The line owner recruits another child. The line keeps running. The NCA estimated that drug-related murders represented 47% of all homicides in England and Wales by the late 2010s, compared with 36% a decade earlier. A third of victims in murder and manslaughter cases were known drug users or suppliers. Two-thirds of suspects were. The expansion of county lines into provincial and coastal towns brought the violence of urban gang markets into communities that had not previously experienced it at that intensity. Cuckooed properties became crime scenes. Addicts who owed money to lines were subjected to violence that exceeded anything they had encountered before the line arrived in their town. Children recruited in London found themselves in places they did not know, among people they did not understand, carrying drugs and cash, and exposed to enforcement from both the police and the gang when something went wrong. The model produced income at every level above the runner. At the runner's level, it produced exposure, debt, violence, and, in a significant number of cases, a criminal record that closed off legitimate opportunities before the person was old enough to have had any. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next gang on this list did not need a provincial network or a phone line. They controlled their city through something older and more direct. A feud between two gangs whose names came from two cafes in a single suburb of Birmingham and whose violence ran for 30 years. Section 8. The Burger Bar Boys and Birmingham's Gang War. Two cafes in Handsworth gave their names to the longest-running gang feud in British urban history. The Burger Bar on Lozells Road and the Johnson's Cafe a short distance away were meeting places for young black men in the late 1980s, the kind of unremarkable neighbourhood hangouts that existed in every city. By the early 1990s, the groups that had formed around those two addresses had acquired names that would remain in the files of West Midlands Police and in the case histories of courts across the Midlands for the next 3 decades and beyond. The Burger Bar Boys took their territory across Smethwick and Handsworth. The Johnson crew, also known as the Johnnies, based themselves in Aston and Lozells, with a larger membership and a network of splinter groups, including the Cash Money crew and the Raiders. Police categorized both gangs from the beginning as involved in drug dealing, robberies, and kidnappings. What the gangs added to those activities from the mid-1990s onward was a sustained and escalating use of firearms in a feud that would not be suppressed by any single prosecution, any sentence, or any policing intervention for 30 years. The shootings began in the last days of 1995, and the context in which they started matters for understanding what came after. West Midlands police correspondent Peter Wilson described the dynamic precisely. Both gangs had initially been engaged in fighting off Yardie gangsters who had arrived in Birmingham from London and Jamaica and were attempting to establish control over parts of the city's drug market. In resisting that incursion, the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew developed the firearms access and the willingness to use them that would subsequently be turned on each other. They learned a specific lesson from the Yardie gangs they had displaced, which was that the gun resolved territorial disputes faster and more decisively than other methods. Once both sides had incorporated that lesson, the question of who would use it first against the other was only a matter of time and provocation. What made the Burger Bar Boys the more feared of the two organizations in the assessment of those who tracked both gangs was a combination of relative wealth and weapons. Police and journalists covering the Birmingham gang scene consistently assessed the Burgers as the richer and more organized of the two groups, with a stronger and more comprehensive collection of firearms than the Johnson crew maintained at any given time. That assessment is consistent with the gun trafficking operations that were later prosecuted and that had direct links to the Burger Bar network. Nosakeer Stevenson headed a group that was linked to the Burger Bar Boys, and that was caught trafficking a range of weapons to criminal gangs across the country, including handguns, a sawn-off shotgun, and a MAC-10 machine pistol capable of discharging 30 rounds in under 2 seconds. Stevenson was originally sentenced to 16.5 years following his conviction for firearms trafficking. The Solicitor General referred the sentences of 14 offenders in the case to the Court of Appeal on the grounds of undue leniency, and the resulting increases added a combined total of more than 50 additional years across the group. The weapons this network was moving were not being sold for recreational or trophy purposes. They were operational. They went to people who intended to use them. The event that brought the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew to national attention happened in the early hours of 2 January 2003, outside a hair salon on Birchfield Road in Aston. A New Year's party had been held at a property nearby, and as the night ended, Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare were standing outside with Charlene's twin sister Sophie, their cousin Cheryl Shaw, and a friend named Leon Harris. Charlene Ellis was 18 years old. Letitia Shakespeare was 17. Neither of them had any involvement in the gang conflict that was about to reach them. A Vauxhall Astra carrying 4 men drove along Birchfield Road. Someone in the car opened fire with a MAC-10 machine pistol. Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare were killed. Sophie Ellis, Cheryl Shaw, and Leon Harris were injured. Sophie Ellis was shot and lost a large quantity of blood, later facing the process of learning to walk again. She would later describe seeing the gun outside the car window in the seconds before the shooting began. The attack was a revenge operation, botched in the most catastrophic way. The intended targets were members of the Johnson crew who were believed to be at or near a party in the area that night. The shooting in 2003 was itself a response to the murder of Johann Martin, a Burger Bar Boys associate. The chain of retaliatory violence that had been running through the feud since the mid-1990s had reached a moment in which 4 men in a car fired a machine pistol into a group standing on a street in Birmingham and killed 2 teenage girls who had nothing to do with any of it. Charlene's twin sister described them as best friends who had simply been at a party. Their mothers spent the following 2 decades campaigning against gun violence. Their grief transformed into advocacy work in a city that had produced the circumstances of their daughters' deaths. The trial of the 4 men charged with the murders was held at Leicester Crown Court, moved from Birmingham to reduce the risk of witness intimidation. That precaution alone communicates something about the environment in which the prosecution was operating. The case relied centrally on a witness who was given the pseudonym Mark Brown and granted lifelong anonymity. It was the first time in an English murder trial that such measures had been applied to a witness. Voice distortion was used during testimony. Restrictions were placed on cross-examination to prevent the witness's identity from being established. The defense teams challenged these arrangements through multiple subsequent appeals, arguing that the restrictions made it impossible to properly test the reliability of the evidence. The European Court of Human Rights ultimately found that the anonymous witness measures had not breached the defendant's right to a fair trial. The 4 men convicted, Marcus Ellis, Nathan Martin, Michael Gregory, and Rodrigo Sims, were each sentenced to life imprisonment at Leicester Crown Court in March 2005. Marcus Ellis and Nathan Martin received minimum terms of 35 years. Rodrigo Sims received a minimum of 27 years. Michael Gregory received a minimum term alongside the others. Marcus Ellis is Charlene Ellis's half-brother. That fact, which emerged during the investigation and prosecution, adds a dimension to the case that resists easy analysis. The killing of his half-sister by the gang he was a member of, in an operation he participated in, was not something the prosecution used as a framing device. It was simply a fact that sat inside the case. The family continued to maintain their son's innocence in the years after conviction, and subsequent legal proceedings were launched challenging the anonymous witness's reliability. Those challenges have not succeeded in overturning the convictions. The 2003 New Year killings did not end the feud. They transformed it, briefly, into a national news story and generated political pressure on West Midlands Police and on the Home Office to address gang violence in Birmingham with more sustained resources. What they did not do was stop the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew from continuing to operate, continuing to accumulate weapons, and continuing to kill. Tafara Beckford was a leading figure in the Burger Bar Boys, whose name appeared in investigation files for years before investigators managed to produce a case that secured a conviction. He had stood trial in connection with 3 separate killings before the one for which he was eventually convicted and sentenced. He was cleared each time, a sequence that the investigating detective superintendent later said had given Beckford the conviction that he was untouchable, that no court would convict him. In the early hours of 30 October 2015, Beckford was outside the Big Bang Snooker Club on Soho Hill in Hockley, Birmingham. A confrontation had developed between members of the Burger Bar Boys and their rivals inside the club's entrance hall. Violence escalated rapidly. Marvin Duffus, a close ally of Beckford's, was stabbed and shot 5 times in an attack that left him permanently brain damaged. In the seconds that followed, Beckford caught up with the man he believed had been responsible and found that man's associate instead. He shot Derek Jr. Myers twice with a handgun, hitting him in the jaw and in the chest. Myers collapsed on the street. He died. The shooting took place in view of members of the public, with a bus passenger witnessing the attack from a nearby vehicle. Beckford received a life sentence with a minimum term of 32 years at Birmingham Crown Court. Detective Superintendent Mark Payne described it as one of the most significant convictions in Birmingham in 20 years. He said the city was a safer place following the conviction. He also described Beckford as an iconic criminal who had operated as though the law did not apply to him. The conviction was the court's answer to that assumption. Rial Phillips occupied what West Midlands Police described as the armed response function of the Burger Bar Boys. He was 20 years old, living on Musgrave Road in Winson Green, when the series of shootings for which he was convicted took place. 7 people were injured across multiple incidents over several months in a feud escalation triggered, in part, by rap videos uploaded online in which members of the rival groups taunted each other. The digital dimension of that escalation reflects how gang conflict had evolved since the 1990s. The mechanism of provocation had changed, moving from territorial incursion and direct confrontation to social media video. But the response the provocation generated remained the same gun on the same street. Phillips admitted firearms offences and conspiracy to sell cocaine and heroin. He was jailed for 27 years. His associate, Ashai Gray, 22, from Tanasitum Drive in Walsall, admitted the same drug conspiracy and received 9 years. Sharif Cousins had been a Burger Bar Boys member who was shot by armed police in Hereford Close in Frankley in July 2017, during what was described as a bloody turf war period in the city. He spent weeks in a coma and survived. After his recovery, he publicly presented himself as a reformed figure who had established a charity aimed at steering young people away from the gang lifestyle, and he was publicly vocal about his own experience as a victim of gun violence as the basis for that work. What he was doing privately during the same period was attempting to supply a firearm to a Birmingham gang. The charity and the gun supply were running simultaneously. He was jailed for 3 years and 9 months after the attempt was uncovered. In 2016 and 2017, West Midlands Police secured what they described as the largest ever gang injunction against the Burger Bar Boys and Johnson crew. 18 men, aged between 19 and 29, some of them serving prison sentences at the time, were banned from parts of Birmingham and required to register their phones and vehicles with police. The injunctions prohibited their association with each other and their entry into specific areas of the city, including Handsworth, Newtown, Winson Green, and Lozells. A further condition, notable for what it revealed about how the conflict had evolved, banned the men from appearing in music videos featuring material linked to either gang. Evidence from one such video had been used in the court proceedings leading to the injunctions. The court imposing the orders was responding not only to the historical pattern of violence, but to the specific contemporary reality that the feud was being conducted through a media channel that had not existed when the gangs first formed in Handsworth in the late 1980s. 30 years of prosecutions, injunctions, firearms seizures, and life sentences had not ended what had started in Handsworth. Beckford's conviction in 2018 was described as one of the most significant in 20 years, which is accurate and also a measure of how much had not been resolved in the 2 decades that preceded it. The 2 teenage girls on Birchfield Road in 2003 are the image that defines the feud for most people who know it only by its most public moment. For the people who investigated and prosecuted it across 30 years, it is a case that kept regenerating itself through a cycle of retaliation that no single conviction or combination of convictions managed to finally break. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Birmingham's gang war ran on personal grievance and territorial pride. The next case ran on none of that. It ran on mathematics, on the price of cocaine at source, the price at distribution, the price at street level, and the size of the fortune you could build in the space between them if you were willing to move fast enough and trust no one. Section 9. Paul Green and the £7 billion network. Paul Green had no previous convictions. He had changed his name twice by deed poll, moving from Simon Swift to James Russell, and then to Paul Green, a sequence he attributed in court to financial difficulties and his own involvement in property and business fraud. He was known to the organised crime groups who paid him a fee for his services as the Big Fella, a title that described his function accurately. He was the central point of contact for a network of criminal organisations across Britain who needed drugs moved from the Netherlands into the country without going through the normal importation risks themselves. They paid Green. Green moved the drugs. The arrangement was effectively a logistics service for the British drug trade, operating between March 2016 and September 2018, and producing, at the assessment of the judge who sentenced him at Manchester Crown Court in December 2024, a minimum of £2 billion worth of drugs by street value and potentially as high as £7 billion. The court described the operation as being on an international and hitherto unprecedented scale. Green was jailed for 32 years. He was 59 years old. The figure of £7 billion requires context to be understood. The NCA made only 6 seizures of drugs attributable to Green's network across the full period of its operation. The total street value of those 6 seizures was £40 million. The leap from 40 million in recovered drugs to 7 billion in estimated total movement was not speculation. It was a calculation built on the proven logistics of the operation. Investigators established that Green's network had conducted at least 240 importation consignments across the 2.5-year window, with up to 4 shipments arriving per week at peak activity. The judge applied a conservative ratio to the seized quantities to arrive at the minimum 2 billion figure and extended it to 7 billion at the upper end. The maths of what those numbers represent in terms of the British drug market is staggering. A single network, run by a man who had changed his name twice and had no criminal record, had been moving product into the country at a frequency and volume that the sentencing judge described as unprecedented. The concealment method Green used was built on a principle that is simple in concept and demands significant operational infrastructure to execute. Strong smells mask the smell of drugs. Trained search dogs work through olfactory detection, identifying the specific chemical signatures of narcotics within cargo. If the cargo in which drugs are concealed produces an overpowering competing smell, the detection threshold rises. Green's network chose onions, garlic, and ginger as the primary concealment produce. These were not selected for logistical convenience. They were selected because their olfactory intensity is sufficient to interfere with detection. The drugs were hidden within pallets of fresh produce at the Dutch end of the supply chain, loaded into freight vehicles operated by innocent haulage firms who had no knowledge of what they were carrying, and moved through the standard commercial freight channels that process hundreds of thousands of legitimate consignments every year. Green's network purchased between 40 and 50 tons of onions per week to maintain this cover. The volume of onions was so large that the network frequently could not find buyers for them in Britain and sent them back to the continent as another cover load. A network that generates billions of pounds in drug revenue and produces so many surplus onions that they have to be shipped back across the North Sea is a measure of the operational scale required to sustain the concealment. The drugs themselves were stamped. Among the evidence presented at trial were photographs of packages marked with the Champions League logo. a branding choice that reflected either a black sense of humor within the network or a deliberate attempt to create a recognized mark that would allow customers to distinguish the product from less reliable sources. The branding of drug packages is not unusual at the higher end of the market. It is a quality signal in an industry with no legal consumer protection mechanisms, and a mark that becomes associated with consistent purity and reliable supply builds its own premium. Green operated as a wholesaler and a logistics provider simultaneously. His network supplied drugs not only to the criminal organizations that paid his importation fee, but also to his own distribution gang, which moved the product out into the British market directly. Among the OCG customers identified in the proceedings was John Kinsella, the Merseyside mob enforcer whose name appears elsewhere in this list as the second victim of the hitman Mark Fellows in May 2018. Kinsella had been purchasing drugs through Green's importation network before Fellows shot him dead in a field in Rainhill. The connection between Green's supply operation and Kinsella's murder is not one of causation, but it illustrates how the top levels of British organised crime are interconnected in ways that become visible only through the accumulated evidence of multiple prosecutions. Green's right-hand man was Stephen Martin, 53 years old and living on Chorley Old Road in Bolton, Greater Manchester. Martin organised the finances of the operation, managing the money that moved between the OCG customers, Green's network, and the Dutch suppliers. He received 28 years at sentencing. Mohammed Ovais, 46, of Bornelia Avenue in Burnage, Manchester, was responsible for distributing drugs to the OCG customer base once they had been imported. He received 27 years. Russell Leonard, 48, of Grosmont Road in Kirkby-on-Merseyside, was a foot soldier who was fluent in Dutch and worked at the Netherlands end of the operation, packing the drugs into the produce consignments and managing logistics on the continental side. He received 24 years. The Dutch principals of the network, Johannes Vesters and Barbara Reinbout, both of Utrecht, were also convicted and sentenced, Vesters to 20 years and Reinbout to 18. A third round of sentencing completed the case, with Sohail Qureshi jailed for 25 years and Khalid Vizier for 20 years. The investigation that unraveled this network started because of an ordinary Dutch lorry driver who noticed something wrong. In September 2016, a haulage driver employed to collect and deliver a consignment for Green's network became suspicious about the cargo he had been asked to move. He returned to his depot and called the police. Officers who examined the consignment found 8 1-kilogram bricks of cocaine inside the load. That telephone call, made by an employee of an innocent haulage firm who trusted his instinct that something was not right, was the event that initiated the NCA investigation that would eventually produce the largest drug smuggling prosecution in British legal history. The investigation ran for years. The trial that followed the investigation was itself record-breaking. One of the 2 trials required to prosecute all 18 defendants lasted 23 months, the longest criminal trial in the recorded history of England and Wales. The second early exposure of the network came through human error rather than suspicion. A month after the September 2016 seizure, Green's network was moving 57 kilograms of amphetamine worth approximately £1.1 million from the Netherlands to the UK. Dutch police had placed members of the group under surveillance and were monitoring their communications. Russell Leonard and an associate who cannot be named for legal reasons were responsible for the safekeeping of the van carrying the amphetamine en route. They went out drinking all night in Amstelveen, a southern suburb of Amsterdam, and left the van unattended and unguarded. Dutch officers were watching. The van sitting unguarded with its cargo while the men responsible for it spent the night drinking in an Amsterdam suburb is the kind of operational failure that law enforcement agencies occasionally encounter in the investigation of otherwise sophisticated criminal enterprises. The men who built complex cover systems using tons of produce and false company identities left 57 kilograms of amphetamine in a van while they went to the pub. Despite these 2 early exposures, the network did not stop. The prosecution described the persistence of the operation through its losses as a defining characteristic. As soon as one company became exposed, they would switch to another. Arrests and drug seizures did not produce operational paralysis. They produced adaptation. The front companies and warehouses in the Netherlands and the north of England were abandoned and replaced. Identities were changed. Green had already changed his own name twice before the network even began, and the pattern of institutional evasion that represented extended into the operation itself. Green communicated through an EncroChat device under the handle Duck Farmer, and the messages recovered from that device after the platform's infiltration provided investigators with a granular record of the shipment arrangements, pricing discussions, and logistical coordination that formed the operational backbone of the network. The use of innocent third parties as the physical carriers of the drugs was not incidental to the model, it was the model. Legitimate haulage firms operated without any knowledge of what they were transporting. The drivers who moved the produce consignments from the Netherlands into Britain were not criminals. They were employees of companies that had been paid to move vegetables. The legal liability for what was hidden inside the produce rested entirely on Green's network, while the physical exposure risk rested on people who were unaware they were carrying anything illegal. This is a structurally different form of insulation from the use of knowing couriers, because a knowing courier can be turned into a witness through negotiation or pressure, while an unknowing driver has no information to provide and no reason to cooperate with anyone other than the police. 2 trials, the longer of which lasted 23 months and the shorter 9, were required to prosecute all 18 defendants. The total combined sentences across the 18 convictions ran to several hundred years. The NCA's regional head of investigations described the group as an extremely high-harm OCG that used every tactic possible to evade detection and cheat justice. The judge described an unprecedented scale. These are formal institutional descriptions of something that the numbers make concrete. A network that moved up to £7 billion worth of heroin, cocaine, cannabis, and amphetamine into Britain across 30 months. That used onions as a weapon against the olfactory capacity of police dogs. That changed its company structure each time investigators got close. And that was finally unraveled because a lorry driver decided to phone the police. Green was born Simon Swift. He became James Russell. He became Paul Green. He became the big fella. He is now a prisoner, serving 32 years for running the largest drug smuggling operation ever detected in the United Kingdom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. £7 billion, 240 consignments, 1 man. The final section pulls back from every case this video has covered and asks what they share, what they reveal about the country they happened in, and what the pattern looks like when you see all of them together. Section 10. Jamie Rothwell, Jonathan Cassidy, and the Noonan crime family. Jamie Rothwell received a threat to life notice from Greater Manchester Police. The notice told him, formally, that credible intelligence suggested someone intended to kill him. Rothwell's response was to leave England and go to Barcelona. From a luxury apartment in the Catalan capital, he continued to run his criminal organisation across Greater Manchester and Cheshire, as though the distance had changed nothing about his position. He ordered a shooting. He traded weapons. He sent cocaine and ketamine back across the channel to a network of associates who carried out his instructions as though he were in the next room rather than a different country. He was 33 years old at the time of his first arrest in Spain. By the time he received his sentence at Manchester Crown Court in August 2025, he was 38, and the judge told him he had lived much of his life as a professional criminal, and that the offences he faced sentencing for graphically illustrated his willingness to follow that path and cause loss and misery to others. He received 43 years. It is the longest sentence handed down to any individual convicted under Operation Venetic's 2,000-plus cases across the United Kingdom. The EncroChat evidence against Rothwell was extensive and specific. He had operated under the handle Livelong, a choice that carried a certain dark irony, given what the messages eventually revealed. Investigators reading his communications found a man who described his own addiction to the criminal lifestyle in terms that were surprisingly direct for someone who believed encrypted messaging to be private. He wrote that when you have fire in your heart, you do not stop, that you get addicted, that you lose everyone, that you turn cold and develop no emotions. The messages were presented at trial alongside evidence of what that coldness had produced in practice. In April 2020, Rothwell instructed an associate to pose as a pizza delivery driver and shoot David Barnes, the stepfather of a rival gang member named Liam Byrne, on his own doorstep in Warrington. Barnes was hit 3 times in the leg. He survived, but the court was told he sustained injuries that would prevent him from walking normally for the rest of his life. The pizza delivery framing was chosen specifically for its deceptive plausibility. A man in a delivery uniform approaching a residential address is not someone anyone looks at twice. Barnes opened his door and was shot 3 times before he understood what was happening. The weapons Rothwell was moving were not confined to the converted handguns and illegal imports that circulate through most British gang networks. The EncroChat messages documented his access to and distribution of AK-47 assault rifles and, the court heard, rocket-propelled grenades. These are military weapons, and their presence in Rothwell's communications reflected access to a European supply chain operating well above the level of the standard British criminal firearms market. Greater Manchester Police described his arsenal as vast. The 25 years covered the firearms, to be served consecutively. The arrest that first identified him as the man behind the livelong handle came through a photograph. Among the messages on his EncroChat device was a selfie. Investigators examining the communications found an image that allowed them to put a face to the handle. A man who had built his operational security on military-grade encryption, who had left England specifically to reduce his physical exposure, took a photograph of himself and sent it through the platform. The photograph broke the anonymity. Once investigators knew that Livelong was Rothwell and that Rothwell was in Barcelona, the rest of the operation was procedural. He was arrested in the city in May 2020. The footage of that arrest was later broadcast publicly and showed him skipping and dancing as Spanish officers approached, a performance that gave way, over subsequent years of extradition proceedings and guilty pleas, to a barrister's submission that he was tired of living a life of isolation, loneliness, and fear. He had been arrested in Spain, returned to the UK, and then fled again to the Netherlands before being brought back a second time. The NCA noted publicly that the agency would never give up on finding and returning those who had fled justice. In Rothwell's case, it required 2 countries, 2 extraditions, and 5 years between his first arrest and his sentencing. Jonathan Cassidy did not carry himself with the deliberate operational caution that characterises the most disciplined figures in British organised crime. He sent an associate a photograph of the actor playing the Mexican drug lord Joaquin Guzman in the television series Narcos, and noted that he and Guzman shared the same birthday. The implication of the comparison was not subtle. Cassidy, 50 years old and from Merseyside, had built a cocaine importation operation that was moving 356 kilograms of the drug, worth approximately £26 million, through a network supplied from South America via the Netherlands. The cocaine was shipped into Britain in modified vehicles. £10 million in cash changed hands in the space of 3 months. His business partner in the operation was Nasser Ahmed, 51, who was described by the sentencing judge as having played an executive role, issuing orders and making the structural decisions that the organisation required. Both Cassidy and Ahmed received 21 years and 9 months at Manchester Crown Court. The operation had been uncovered through EncroChat, the same platform that brought down Bell, Rothwell, and dozens of other networks across Britain. Cassidy's handle on the platform was not recorded in the same detail as some others, but the content of his messages was specific enough to establish his role beyond doubt. He had arranged shipments, managed prices, and directed the movement of cocaine across England. He had also, the prosecution noted, allowed himself the kind of self-mythology that the platform's apparent security made easy. The El Chapo comparison was not a throwaway remark. It was a reflection of how Cassidy understood his own position in the criminal economy he had built. The specific detail that set this case apart from the broader landscape of EncroChat prosecutions was his brother. Jamie Cassidy, 46, had been one of the most promising footballers of his generation. He played alongside Michael Owen and Jamie Carragher in the Liverpool FC youth team that won the FA Youth Cup in 1996. At 15, he had been the leading scorer in the England under-16 squad. Injuries to his leg and knee ended his professional career before it properly began. He was released by Liverpool in 1999 at 21, and in the 2 decades that followed, he moved gradually into the operational structure of his older brother's criminal enterprise. He was not a principal. His role was managerial, distributing cocaine across England and Scotland through a network of couriers, passing on instructions, keeping things moving. His EncroChat handle was Nuclear Dog. He was jailed for 13 years and 3 months. The sentencing judge acknowledged his positive character and the circumstances that had drawn him toward his brother's world. His barrister described him as a footballer of exceptional talent and promise, whose injuries had entirely wrecked his career. The court accepted that framing as relevant to his role and his sentence. It did not change what he had done. 2 decades in the margins of a cocaine importation network that dealt in kilos and millions ends the same way regardless of what you once could do with a football. Gary O'Regan was 34 years old, from Derby Road in Salford, and was arrested on the M62 in February 2018 in a BMW X5 containing a gun and ammunition. He had returned to the UK from Spain specifically to organise an operation that was distributing cocaine and heroin across the north of England and into Wales and the West Midlands. The cocaine was arriving from southern Spain, where O'Regan had been based before police surveillance forced him back. His associate, Sam O'Neill, was stopped separately and found to have 30 kilograms of high-purity cocaine in shoeboxes inside his car. When officers searched a storage unit connected to the network, they found equipment and chemicals capable of producing 300 kilograms of amphetamine. O'Regan had gone one step further than most drug network operators at his level by flying a Hungarian chemist to Manchester and spending £3,000 on laboratory equipment to manufacture amphetamine domestically alongside the imported cocaine operation. Officers said the network was distributing drugs to Sunderland, Middlesbrough, Kettering, the West Midlands and Wales from a base in Salford. In total, 35 kilograms of drugs were found across vehicles and properties linked to O'Neill alone. O'Regan was found guilty of conspiracy to supply cocaine after pleading guilty to possession of a firearm and conspiracy to produce amphetamine. He was jailed for 24 years at Manchester Crown Court. His co-defendants received sentences ranging from 6 to 16 years. The Noonan crime family occupied Manchester's criminal underworld through the 1980s and 1990s in a way that was different in character from most of the networks in this video. Desmond and Dominic Noonan, brothers from a large family raised in Whalley Range, built their organisation around protection rackets, nightclub security, armed robbery, and violent enforcement, rather than around a single drug distribution empire. Though drugs ran through the family's activities throughout their active years, they rose to prominence after the murder of Anthony Johnson, the leader of the Cheetham Hill Gang, who was shot dead in 1991. Desmond was charged and acquitted after a retrial. The acquittal was consistent with a pattern that defined the family's relationship with the courts for decades. Key witnesses declined to testify, retracted statements, or became unavailable in ways that investigators attributed to the credible threat of violence that came with giving evidence against the Noonans. Dominic accumulated more than 40 convictions across his criminal career, covering armed robbery, firearms possession, assault on police, prison escape, and fraud. He changed his name by deed poll to Dominic Latley Fotfoy, an acronym for a phrase that encoded his philosophy of loyalty and retaliation, in terms direct enough to require no explanation. His most serious conviction in later years was for sexual offences involving a minor. Desmond Noonan died in March 2005, stabbed during a confrontation in Chorlton. He was 45 years old. A drug dealer named Derek McDuffus, who had connections to Jamaican Yardie networks, was convicted of his murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 15 years. Desmond had been, by any formal measure, a violent criminal who had spent 20 years building an organisation through fear and enforcement. He was also, by the measure of people in his immediate community, someone who provided something real. People came to him with problems they did not take to the police. Disputes got resolved. That tension does not make him other than what the conviction record shows him to have been. It makes him representative of a specific kind of British organised crime figure, whose power is both predatory and protective at the same time, whose criminal function and community function became so intertwined over so many years that pulling them apart was no longer possible. Rothwell was brought back from Spain. He fled to the Netherlands. He was brought back again, 5 years between his first arrest and his sentence. Cassidy spent 2 decades in his brother's orbit before the courts reached him. The Noonan family ran the same operation through the same city for 30 years and watched witnesses choose silence over testimony again and again because the alternative was too dangerous to consider. What all of that adds up to is not a collection of bad decisions. It is a way of life that these men had committed to completely, that they returned to after every loss, that they rebuilt around every arrest, and that only ended when the sentences became long enough to make rebuilding impossible. Rothwell's 43 years will do that. So will the 21 years and 9 months handed to the man who compared himself to El Chapo from behind an encrypted screen in a Merseyside kitchen. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.